So, guten Morgen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zur Bad Homburg Conference 2020. Mein Name ist Johannes Völz. Ich bin Professor für Amerikanistik an der Goethe University Frankfurt und Mitglied im wissenschaftlichen Direktorium hier am Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften in Bad Homburg. Ich begrüße Sie im Raum hier, in unseren schönen Räumlichkeiten hier am Wingertsberg, und ich begrüße Sie gleichzeitig im World Wide Web für diejenigen, die unsere Veranstaltung im Livestream auf YouTube verfolgen. Ich möchte ganz kurz nochmal mit einem Dank beginnen, mit einem Dank an die Stadt Bad Homburg, die Bad Homburg Conferences ermöglichen. Ganz insbesondere geht mein Dank an den Oberbürgermeister Alexander Hetjes, der gestern auch ein Grußwort gehalten hat, und außerdem an Dr. Bettina Genske, die heute auch anwesend ist und die Kulturdezernentin Bad Homburgs ist und in der Programmplanung dieser Bad Homburg Conference auch tatkräftig mitgewirkt hat. Außerdem möchte ich mich ganz kurz bedanken bei der geschäftsführenden Direktorin des Forschungskollegs, Iris Koban, und darüber hinaus bei Thomas Schimmer, dem wissenschaftlichen Referenten am Forschungskolleg. Ich werde jetzt die Sprache ins Englische wechseln, denn die heutige Veranstaltung, zumindest dieses erste Panel, wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Aber da Sie sich alle mit dem Thema der transatlantischen Beziehungen offensichtlich schon so weit auskennen, dass es Sie so sehr interessiert, dass Sie hierher gekommen sind, sind Sie auch bestimmt in der Lage, der Veranstaltung auf Englisch zu folgen. So I will switch now and say just a few words about our topic, Transatlantic Futures, Shared or Divided. Last night in the opening lecture by former German ambassador Klaus Schariot, we heard several interesting points that to me stand out, and I just want to repeat them once more because I think for everybody who couldn't see or couldn't hear the lecture, they bear repeating. The first is that Dr. Schariot pointed out that what we are facing right now in transatlantic relations is indeed the biggest crisis since World War II. The other point that he mentioned is that the upcoming presidential elections in the United States are indeed the most important ones since the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. So this is an extraordinary moment of crisis, and we here at the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften thought and are of the opinion that in this moment of crisis, it is all the more important to turn to the question of transatlantic relations, make this the topic of the Bad Homburg Conference, but also turn it into a focus of study here at the Forschungskolleg in the next couple of years. The way we conceptualize transatlantic relations is multidimensional, not just as a matter of politics, not just as a matter of foreign policy or perhaps of international security, but also as a matter of economics and, crucially, as a matter of culture. And indeed, it is this cultural dimension of transatlantic relations with which we want to begin the Bad Homburg Conference in our first panel today. The cultural dimension of transatlantic relations, we can say, becomes all the more important as political actors of transatlantic relations turn more isolationist. So, in a sense, the crisis of the political dimension of transatlantic relations makes the cultural dimension more essential, more relevant, more crucial than ever. And this is the reason why we start today with the panel Transatlantic Popular Culture After the American Century. And I think that everybody will agree that from at least a European side, the fact that there is a crisis in transatlantic relations by no means means that there is less interest in the United States. The sheer amount of press coverage about what goes on in the United States is, to my mind, astounding. Oftentimes it will happen that the amount of coverage that German media pay to the United States is about as extensive as the coverage paid to affairs in Germany and Europe. So this tells you something about the vitality of the interest in the transatlantic on the ground. Now, historically, the dimension of culture for transatlantic relations has been recognized not just by people in general, but by state actors in particular. And when we look back to the early years after World War II, American politicians recognized very clearly the fundamental role that culture played. And just to give you two examples, when we think of what is called the Cultural Cold War, we can see how much American efforts to construe a multilateral transatlantic world system relied on efforts of culture. So the CIA, for instance, decided to sponsor literary publications both in the United States and in Europe and in Latin America. The CIA also sponsored the Iowa Writers' Workshop, the most important creative writing program in the United States. The Iowa Writers' Workshop produced famous writers like Flannery O'Connor, Wallace Stegner, and more recently T.C. Boyle. The State Department sent around the world African-American jazz musicians to go on State Department tours to use jazz as a kind of a musical message of freedom that was supposed to represent what America stood for. But of course, American popular culture was always more than what the US government wanted it to be, and in particular, it was a medium of protest against the US government, and I would say that it is in its dimension of providing a voice of protest and providing a voice for marginalized groups that popular culture, American popular culture, became internationally successful and even dominant. And in a sense, American popular culture gave voice to the marginalized, but it also gave voice to individual expression. So American popular culture sort of established an international, we could say an international regime of individualism. The question today is whether popular culture and culture in general can help us in any way out of the crisis that I have described, the crisis of transatlantic relations, whether popular culture has a role to play in this regard. And in order to answer this question, we also have to consider what is the status of American popular culture in the world today. These are the questions that we want to discuss in today's workshop, and I'm very happy to have 4 excellent experts to discuss these questions, and I will briefly introduce all 4 of them. Then after this round of very brief introductions, each of the panelists will present a 10-minute statement, a kind of a position statement, after which we will engage first in a collective discussion among the panelists, and then we will open it up to a Q&A, question and answer session that involves everybody in the room and also involves the viewers online who are also invited to ask questions that will be then transmitted to the room. So I begin the introductions on my far right with Verena Lueken. Verena Lueken is an author and a critic. She's an editor in the culture section at Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And for many years, she was the cultural correspondent of the Frankfurter Allgemeine in New York. She has a number of book publications outside of her journalistic work, among them 2 non-fiction books. One is called New York, Reportage aus einer alten Stadt, and the other one is Gebrauchsanweisung für New York. But she is also a novelist. Her highly acclaimed debut novel, Alles zählt, was published in 2015, and it was followed by her second novel, Anderswo, in 2018. She has also been awarded for her journalistic work several times. She has won the International Journalism Prize in Klagenfurt and the Michael Alten Prize for Criticism. And I'm very glad that she is with us. Then immediately to my right, we have Ellen Harrington. She is the director of the DFF, the Deutsches Filminstitut und Filmmuseum. She came to Frankfurt 2 years ago after a long career in Hollywood. And at the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences in Beverly Hills, she worked as a producer of film events and curator of exhibitions. And in 2013, she became director of exhibitions and collections at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in LA. Before that, she also worked in the industry with Warner Brothers and was involved in film productions of Dustin Hoffman. And she also worked in the CAA, the Creative Arts Agency. Her career start, however, was in the theater, and particularly at the New York Public Theater. She studied literature, medieval studies, art history, and film studies at Dartmouth College and at the NYU. Now, I will continue on my far left because this is also the order in which we will hear the short presentations by our panelists. On my far left is Vinzenz Hediger. He is professor of film studies at Goethe University, Frankfurt. He has published many books, articles, and collections, and there are so many that I'm not going to even mention a single one. Instead, I'm going to mention a couple of his many research interests and research areas. He is interested in the history and aesthetics of film, in film theory, and in interrelationships between politics and media, as well as democracy and cinema. He has influential, important research projects funded by the most prestigious funding organizations in German academe, among them Configuring the Demos, which is part of the research network Normative Orders. And he is also very interested in a question that is very pertinent to our discussion, namely the question of distribution on a worldwide scale when it comes to culture. In general, he's an expert for the interrelation between culture, aesthetics, and economics. And then finally, to my immediate left, we have Professor Ruth Meyer. She is Professor of American Studies at the University of Hannover. She is a specialist for globalized cultural flows and for cultural hybridity, but also she is an expert in theories of popular and mass culture, in media history, and in gender studies. She has several research projects going on right now funded by the German Research Foundation, and I'll just mention two: Contingency on Contraction, Modernity and Temporality in the United States, 1880 to 1920 is one of them. The other one is called Multiplication, Modernity, Mass Culture, Gender in the United States, 1910 to 1933. And you see here also an interest in the questions that concern us today, namely the question of mass culture, American mass culture, and its global reach. So I'm very glad that all of you could participate in these very difficult circumstances. And now we will hear the first opening statement by Verena Lueken. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this friendly and long presentation of us and of me. Hello, everybody. I try to be short and easy. The American century in popular culture has come to an end. Is that so? What does it mean? Does it mean worldwide de-Americanization? The rise of regional pop cultural empires, smaller ones, spite-specific content, produced by what money? Stored on whose servers? Distributed through which channels? Yes, the American century has come to an end as far as it had anything to do with the United States as a nation and the ideology it represented. But the entertainment industry, as we have heard already, Hollywood, was never identical with America, the nation, and the ideology attached. There were, of course, crossovers. There was a production code once, presidents who changed sides. But for quite a while now, through money and public star appearances and endorsements, for instance, the political influence of the industry on the political scene is more obvious than the other way around. Has America lost its global appeal as a nation? Certainly. As a vision, maybe so. As a power over imagery, minds, narratives, I'm not so sure. If asked what succeeds America as the dominant force in global popular culture, I want to say not only for the sake of simplicity, just one word, Disney. And then add another word, Disney Plus. Day by day, news is spread about more and more countries where Disney Plus launched its streaming service. Territories now served by the streamer include Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Channel Islands, France, Germany, Iceland, India and Indonesia, Ireland, Isle of Man, Italy, Japan, Monaco, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Puerto Rico, Spain, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. Quote, we have surpassed 60.5 million paid subscribers globally. As a major force in the global direct-to-consumer space, we are bringing high-quality, optimistic storytelling that you expect from our brands to even more people, said Rebecca Campbell, chair of Walt Disney Direct-to-Consumer and International Affairs. This was the news as of last Tuesday. Is there any company in any country that can compete? With Disney Plus, the Walt Disney Company has created an unparalleled integrated empire of production, distribution, and consumption. Battalions of experts in anthropology, psychology, or more general in cultural studies are employed to listen to scouts who go shopping with kids for toys, some of which are tie-ins to movies, obviously. More ethnic and gender diversity is promised and planned. How could Adorno and Horkheimer know about this already 80 years ago and give it the name Kulturindustrie? Disney is on the verge to monopolize a large chunk of the images we see, animated or live action. Do they make decent movies once in a while? They do. This is another thing the chaps of the Frankfurter Schule knew about. Aufklärung als Massenbetrug, they called it. When I got invited on this panel some months ago, I thought to explore how the call for diversity to break the American dominance fed the blockbusters to come. But with COVID-19, the perspective has changed. Some of the movies I thought I'd talk about today might not even be produced. What has not changed so far is this. The American century became the Disney era. But Disney might be hit the hardest by the pandemic, since part of its powerful empire is amusement parks that had to close and movie houses which have been shut down. Just in the early months of the year, I would have predicted a 2020 as one of the most profitable years for Disney. It had just announced the start of the above-mentioned streaming service Disney Plus. It has an enormous backlist to feed it. Over the last years, the company has swallowed not only the digital animation competitor Pixar, which is noticeable because animation is the #1 profit maker in movies worldwide, but also the Star Wars franchise and the Marvel Empire. There were blockbuster movies in the pipeline for release in 2020 and the following years, which promised huge profits and new viewership. But production, as well as release dates had to be postponed for a year or more or cancelled altogether. Among them, 4 Avatar movies alone by James Cameron, a new Star Wars trilogy, Wonder Woman, Black Widow, and so on. What's left of my diversity and the blockbuster theme is Mulan. Mulan, the movie, was supposed to be Disney's icebreaker for the Asian market, a monster production with a $200 million budget and the same in marketing cost, all set to be playing in tens of thousands movie theaters all over the world, especially in Asia and there especially in China. To diversify has nothing to do with justice. It is a means to stay in business and to come into business with the rest of the world that does not look and does not want to live like Americans or Europeans for that matter. Mulan, which tells a Chinese legend, was supposed to show the world, and China first, that Disney was willing to comply. All actors are Asian. The director is from New Zealand, Nikki Caro, a woman. And the story, of course, is as Chinese as they come. And with 17 or so film and TV adaptations so far, it is well tested as a crowd pleaser. COVID-19 made for a bumpy start. First, there were postponements. Then, the decision to give the potential money machine right away to streaming. Simultaneously, Disney went for a big launch in China's movie theaters, meant as a special treat and, of course, a business opportunity. But that did not work out. The Chinese did not come, not enough at least. Some called for a boycott because the movie was shot in the northwestern region of Xinjiang, where presumably 1 million Muslim people live under severe pressure or in concentration camps. There were protests, social media campaigns. Finally, Chinese officials asked the media to shy away from further reports on the movie. The ticket sales are disastrous, as are the reactions of Chinese viewers who actually saw the film. They called it offensively inauthentic, which is a surprising term in this respect, as many Chinese viewers supposedly have a nostalgia-tinged fondness of Disney's animated version of this poem from the 5th century. Some examples of viewer responses in China that the trade magazine Variety has collected, I want to give you. Quote, the special effects were very embarrassing. I felt like I could have been watching Shaolin soccer, one reviewer wrote, while others bemoaned the standards of its kung fu, comparing the fight scenes to those found in local costume dramas from a decade ago. One viewer wrote that the script felt like a Google Translate take on Chinese, which means China refused to accept an Americanized version of itself. Bad news for Disney, of course, and for America. Economically, Mulan will be a catastrophe. Just a short while ago, I would have argued that the American century has been replaced by the century of Disney, carried a slight hope to see a fuller picture of the world. After Mulan, I doubt that there is a chance of real diversity produced through a studio giant. And few months into the pandemic, there is not a small possibility that Disney will falter to a point where another big American company might just buy it. So maybe the shameful experience with Mulan is foreshadowing a much wider defeat. Who could be the buyer? Apple maybe? Amazon? If this should happen, we'll enter some unknown, as the last ties to a movie industry that started out by actually making movies would be cut. What does all this mean for the transatlantic relations? For once, it means China might be Hollywood's dream, but Europe is still a sure business for it. Here, Mulan has received mostly positive reviews. Serious streaming numbers are not out yet, but they will be sufficient if rumors hold. American pop culture is still firmly situated here and in charge of more or less all the channels that feed into European households and minds. With content we recognize as American, even if it is made to look Chinese. Is this a good thing? I don't know. It's what we've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena Lueken. I would like to now give the word to Ellen Harrington.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to take part today. The 21st century has been a rude awakening for America so far, and 2020 has seen the nadir of Americans' international influence in the global political and economic sphere, with isolationist tendencies taking precedence over previous policies of engagement and cooperation. Just a few years ago, it might have been unimaginable to write that sentence. And yet here we sit, less than 2 months out from a US presidential election, so compromised that partisan lawyers are already preparing to contest the result, any result, on a state-by-state basis until the American public descends into armed conflict on the streets. And in the last 12 hours, a significant development, and a very sad one for me, has taken place with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a pioneering feminist and probably the most consequential Supreme Court justice of my lifetime. And now we will see a very dramatic next weeks of positioning and political infighting about whether or not her seat can actually be renominated and awarded to a nominee by the current president, or whether they will have to wait. And I didn't write this in my remarks, but I really feel Ruth Bader Ginsburg is so, today is such a crucial moment because she was the person in the room where it happens. This expression came from the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, a Puerto Rican American, in the theater. It was premiered at the Shakespeare Festival at the New York Public Theater in New York. And she exemplified this notion that you do have to be in the room where it happens. And so I find that particular musical, and the fact that it was filmed and meant to be on screen and ultimately released by Disney Plus, ironically, was so exemplary of the optimism that we felt as Americans when Obama was elected. And of course, the first workshop of this musical was in fact performed at the White House. So I've gone off my text a little bit, but I really think that this is a consequential day for America and for the future of this election. As an American who's been living and working in Germany for the past 2 years, I've been watching in horror as my country is literally burning. Conflagrations have been incited by hateful rhetoric and social media rumor, incidents of police brutality and shootings, protests, lootings, drought, lightning strikes, global warming, and naked political ambition. And then there's COVID-19. And this pandemic has somehow turned into a rallying cry, not for access to universal health care in the United States, but as an opportunity for people to express their quote-unquote God-given right not to wear a mask. So it's hard not to feel that we're living through some kind of end times. America's come to this point in the past of almost unraveling. And of course, the ambassador last night mentioned the Civil War and how consequential that election was. And of course, I agree with him, this election is equally consequential. Other moments in American history was the brutality and discrimination that followed the Civil War with the Reconstruction period, the reckoning of the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement and the assassinations and Vietnam War conflict at that time. America as a place and as an idea survived those earlier fires, but at an extraordinarily high cost to the majority of its citizens. Women, as I mentioned before, people of color, the economically disenfranchised. Much of the current reckoning that you can see on the news in a daily way has to do with the delayed realization that actual systems were formally established to enforce unequal access to the benefits of society on behalf of the very few. And as the conference text rightly points out, no empire survives forever. So perhaps we're just living through the natural demise of one inordinately powerful society, and perhaps a kind of opening for a different way to imagine our existence and our survival as more of a common species than as disparate groups of stereotypically costumed, nation-identified hordes. But this conference is called Transatlantic Futures, after all, so I think we should pivot to the assumption that we will have one. We will have a future. Let's focus for a few minutes on this notion of soft power and how the arts and entertainment industries have functioned within this political discourse. Rightly, the conference text posits that arts and creators have, quote, spoken truth to power. Again, the quote from the conference text, "It made those voices heard that denounced the failure to uphold American and European values, not by means of discourse, but by aesthetic expression." For each of the historical injustices or current crises I just mentioned, there is in fact an identifiable group of artists, writers, filmmakers, visual artists, songwriters, and singers who have and are addressing these themes, and whose work is being taken up by people on the current front lines of this latest culture war. But at the same time, even as the respect for America's previous self-identified role as defender of democracy and cooperation around the globe has fallen off a cliff, American cultural content has continued to dominate the global conversation and marketplace. And of course, the most widely known American cultural content is not generally, in fact, the more politically engaged or socially aware movies and visual artists and songs. What we're, in fact, mostly confronted with is the most commercial films, the popcorn films, the most commercial music, the American pop music that can be heard on every radio around the globe. A wide gulf exists between the realm of commercial cultural production and that of the quote-unquote engaged artist who is hoping to impact more than their income or popularity with their latest works. Yet in many ways, these engaged artists have emerged as a powerful counterforce to the retreat of official American state participation. When the US government is censoring its own Voice of America reporters and banning outspoken writers, people of color, and LGBTQI artists from American-sponsored readings and events around the world, which is actively happening within our consular service, the people have found new ways around these old delivery methods. Social media has been a seismic leveler, with artists able to release their work directly to the public and develop a visible public voice in active opposition to both entrenched commercial interests and overt government sector suppression. The pandemic has only exacerbated this trend. And of course, this is a dynamic trend in politics as well, as we have the first reality star president in America and a master of the Twitter format, and this has become the real front line, I would say, of the culture war. By directly addressing and incorporating the critiques arising in social media or social movements throughout the US and around the world, a profound new relevance for the cultural sector may be emerging. And this is my hope. But it's also tearing apart the old structures and expectations on which the culture industry was built by embracing disruption. Already, before the pandemic, the Me Too and Oscars So White movements had already begun to redress historic exclusion of broad sectors of humanity at the paid creative table. And this is really important. Again, going back to being in the room where it happens, it's important to also be paid for your creative work. And this has been a rarity for women, for people of color, for diverse people in the LGBTQ community. The global pandemic has suddenly and dramatically exacerbated the ongoing changes to the marketplace, the tools of production and delivery, and the physical experience of viewing films. Many open questions remain, but it is clear that post-pandemic, it will be impossible to go back to doing business the way it has always been done, whether or not it's because economic disruption has literally bankrupted some of these producers, but also because the public is going to have a different set of expectations. Will these new voices really be able to seize the quote-unquote reins of production and affect lasting change? And how will global audiences respond? And perhaps one very important question we can talk about later, will they still want what America is selling? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen Harrington. Next up is Vincent Seliga.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't be here last night, but I'm all the happier to be here today. So we're here to discuss the American century in popular culture, and for me there are two aspects of this topic, a personal one and a professional one. Personally, I think that the United States as a model of governance for other parts of the world has pretty much run its course. In the 1950s and 1960s, the white middle class in the US certainly had it better than most people anywhere in the world, but that was then. Today, why would anyone in Western Europe, or South Korea for that matter, trade their healthcare, education system, public infrastructure, electoral process, and overall system of governance for the substandard alternatives prevailing in the US? At this point, I sometimes feel I pay attention to the United States mainly because we have to. Because America is too big, too loud, and too threatening to ignore. America the Beautiful has become America the Obnoxious, a drunk uncle hell-bent on ruining your party and refusing to leave. Now, it is important to note that I'm saying all this not as your run-of-the-mill German America hater, whether of the left-wing anti-capitalist persuasion or the right-wing Deutsche Kultur is superior to American civilization persuasion. I'm saying this as someone who has practically grown up in the US, or rather in an upper-middle-class European version of the US. I grew up in the 1970s in Switzerland, the United States sister republic. There have been long and strong ties between the two countries. And the friends of my parents served in Lions and Rotary clubs, drove American cars, followed American football, read Reader's Digest, and banded together in political action committees modeled on the John Birch Society to fight the spread of communism. So I'm speaking to you as someone who has lived in and through the American century and has, so to speak, outgrown it. Now to the professional point of view. In a recent book on the global impact of Korean pop music, Turkish television, and Indian movies, Pakistani writer Fatima Bhutto declared the dawn of a new world order of cultural production, which is no longer dominated by the American culture industries. Incidentally, Bhutto's argument reflects my own professional trajectory as a scholar of film and media. Having dedicated much of my early career to the study of the American film industry, I have more recently refocused my attention towards what academics like to call the global South. As a matter of fact, at Goethe University, we're just about to embark on an interdisciplinary 6-year research project in which we study the cultural industries, music and film in Nigeria and South Korea in comparison, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. In that light, I want to raise 2 points of discussion from a researcher's point of view. The first point concerns something that Verena and Ellen have already been addressing, namely what we can expect to be the continuing strength of the American culture industries despite America's loss of political standing in the world. Strictly speaking, Hollywood has never been a national cinema or a national industry. It has always been an industry with a global outlook. As early as the 1930s, 40% of total revenue of Hollywood came from overseas. Since the 1990s, it's 60% or more. Before the First World War, two French companies, Pathé and Gaumont, dominated the world market for film. Since the First World War, Hollywood has dominated the world market for film through a combination of self-inflicted harm of their European competitors and this matters most, the size of the US home market, which provided the basis for unmatched levels of investments in production budgets and the ability to hire the best artists and technicians, including, of course, in the 1920s, German stars like Emil Jannings and Paul Negri and directors like Ernst Lubitsch. So as much as I subscribe to Fatima Bhutto's argument about a new world order of cultural production, bearing a full lockdown on high-skilled immigration, Hollywood will continue to be able to set technological standards, as it did recently by defining the world standards for digital distribution and production, and it will be able to continue to recruit the best global talent, which means that it will continue to be at least a global player. However, to Fatima Bhutto's list of new poles of the multipolar order, we need to add the country that Verena has already talked about, the People's Republic of China. 2020 will mark the year in which China officially surpasses the US as the largest domestic theatrical market for movies. And as I indicated above, the home market size is absolutely crucial when it comes to the global radiance of a culture industry. Theatrical films have the longest value chain of all media formats. They basically never grow old. They come out in cinemas and you can continue to make money with them 40, 50 years after their initial release. There's always a new generation who will discover Jaws or Star Wars. So different from newspapers or news formats, movies never grow old, and the theatrical market is the shop window where you launch the film and introduce it as a global brand. So to have the largest home market in the world is an absolutely crucial factor of your ability to radiate beyond your boundaries and to potentially dominate the world. The Chinese know that, of course. China has always been good at cultural exports. During the 1960s and 70s, for instance, China exported guerrilla warfare to the global south and the Cultural Revolution to the global north, particularly to Western Europe, both with considerable success. Building on that experience, China now hopes to create a film industry to rival Hollywood. At the same time, Hollywood, as we have seen also from Verena's intervention, Hollywood is extremely eager to do business in China to the point where they are willing to accept import quotas and restrictions on content which it would never accept from any other country in the world. So as in other areas of geopolitics, the relationship to study in the near future in popular culture is probably not so much the North Atlantic axis as it is the America-Asia and particularly America-China axis. My second point picks up on something that Ellen said, and it is this. President Trump has often been described, I said the name, you avoided it. The current president has often been described as a regrettable aberration in the history of American politics. I would like to say that he isn't. He is as American as apple pie. Obama represented what America aspires to be. Trump is, to quote the man himself, what it is. Every society has its pathologies, and Trump is everything that is wrong with America without the veneer of false pretense. That said, Trump, who famously entered politics as an outsider, cannot be understood, of course, in terms of politics alone. Rather, Trumpism is indeed, as Ellen also already said, a form of popular culture. The most important development in popular culture of the last quarter century is the global ascendancy of reality television, of formats such as Big Brother, Survivor, and of course, The Apprentice. Most of these formats, by the way, were created by a Dutch company, Endemol, and licensed to other countries around the world. In that sense, reality TV is the most significant Dutch contribution to globalization since capitalism itself. Reality TV provides an important frame for understanding Trump's political power. To the continuing bafflement of political scientists, Trump has evaded all consequences for his actions, surviving a series of scandals, any of which would have instantly stopped a more conventional politician seeking the presidency in their tracks. Where George W. Bush polled in the high 20s towards the end of his second term, Trump, despite his abysmal record, continues to poll in the high 30s and low 40s. Political science models for electoral behavior can neither predict nor explain such results. Media studies, on the other hand, can, and particularly fan culture studies. Trump may be best understood as a Frankenstein figure of popular culture, sewn together from popular television formats and narratives which actually are too low in quality for polite scholars to even consider. And the bond that links his supporters to this Frankenstein figure may best be understood as a form of fandom, an unconditional allegiance which is impervious to the kind of rational calculus which guides electoral behavior in the models of political science. So for someone of my profession, the current state of American politics and popular culture has at least this one upside. As the American century draws to its noisy but inexorable close, political analysis has become inseparable from the study of media and popular culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinzenz Hediger. Our final presentation comes from Ruth Meyer.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks also for the chance to speak in front of a live audience and some others, but it's really great to be in a real room in front of real people once more. So, when I was asked to contribute to a discussion about the global relevance of contemporary American pop culture, or the lack thereof, I was initially at a loss. True, US popular films, television series, pop songs are no longer necessarily the major or most important players in a global market. We've talked about this before, we've heard about this. And they are about to lose ground against other culture industries elsewhere. But given the overall situation of today, this feels like one of the least important issues of the contemporary United States, and by extension, the world. So when I was reading the blurb to this panel, I couldn't help but feel initially that the other panels seem to deal with much more substantial and pressing questions than the one that I was invited to, and sadly, also most qualified to talk about. So, you know, the plight of the cultural studies scholar that may be changing right now, as we just heard. This may also have to do with the fact that the question about American pop cultural relevance has been, in some or other inflection, an integral part of my academic coming of age, which is, I think, by now pretty much concluded. It seems that there is nothing more to say about this. My gut feeling at first was that if the US culture industry is going down, good riddance. There is so much more interesting stuff around, and more than we can possibly keep track of. But then I thought that I was perhaps a bit too quick to kiss American popular culture goodbye. So I revisited the question, asking myself, where do I feel the impact of US popular culture most ardently these days? And the answer came immediately: in politics. As a teacher, a mother, a user of social media, I come across what could be called pop politics everywhere. In the 2010s, iconic figures in popular culture, in film, in music, in social media, took up political causes such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, LGBTQ+ rights with unprecedented resonance, not only with regard to public life, but also increasingly within their own institutional and medial environments. And for perhaps the first time in a long history of pop cultural struggles around authenticity and subversion, resistance and accommodation, this political outspokenness, even radicality, more often than not, was not penalized, and in innumerable cases, paid out commercially and career-wise for artists who did not build their career on political positions. So I'm thinking of megastars like Beyoncé or Emma Watson, Watson, whose careers are not about politics or political issues, but who consistently kind of bring this up. This is much to do with the way that the internet works. The celebrity protest is visible and it is iconic. If I have to see this meme of Meryl Streep cheering on the protest for equal pay at the Oscars 2015 one more time, I'm going to faint. You're probably familiar with this. She's clapping, she's cheering, and it's used for all sorts of occasions. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining that this is all strategic maneuvering or cynical calculation. I actually don't care if it is. I'm glad that practices that were tacitly accepted 20 or 30 years ago because it seemed futile or even dangerous to contest them, or because the people being attacked or victimized weren't even fully aware of what was happening to them, are now routinely and aggressively pointed out for what they are. I'm also aware of the fact that protest in pop culture has always been as much a style as an agenda. Sometimes you join a movement because its outfits look good. And obviously being subversive could very well pay out in the past too. I myself have been writing about the strategic politicality of hip-hop already in the 1990s. Still, things are different today. It seems as if we have entered a new phase of political communication. And not only in the US, where the stark polarization of the political landscape seems to push superstars in one of two camps, and where the poor performance of so many news channels has led to satirical late-night shows' implementation as major sources of reliable information. What is remarkable about the press... I'm being doubled. What is remarkable about the present pop political culture is its sheer scale, its speed and the brevity and instantaneity of the messages that are being communicated. This is not about individual agents or scenes representing or disseminating specific political causes, but resembles a symbolical and affective avalanche, an iconic and rhetorical style change of monumental dimensions that has long reached the discourses of political debate and public communication on this side of the Atlantic too. This also means that the concern with the proper or inappropriate modes of conduct with respect, rights, and representation has become a core concern of pop culture, which used to be interested more in breaking the rules than in establishing new ones in the past. What started in the culture wars of the late 20th century on the sidelines has now moved center stage in pop culture, and the political right has picked up many of the cues from the left in this battle for social recognition and a transformation of public and political symbolic registers. This is more than political correctness, to which it is often reduced, because it does not only concern linguistic codes and forms of social interaction, but a much wider range of affective and aesthetic principles of expression and self-assertion. All of this impacts fundamentally on how disagreement and dissent are acted out or suppressed in cultural communication. It is interesting to see the sweeping effects of this transformation and to witness real political and institutional responses to the pop political movements. Time and again, processes of political and institutional decision-making are overtaken and swept aside by the force of public outrage or effective persuasion. There is obviously a danger of populist totalization in this, and everybody here has addressed this, and we've talked about this before. But at its core, it is important to see that pop politics formulate a legitimate and necessary challenge to the status quo of political and public debating, with its demand for faster, more immediate responses and more transparent responses and interaction. Whether this is about climate change or about gender and race equality, the repercussions are tremendous. There are people that suggest that if only pop politics could become a bit more nuanced, less affect-driven, more rational, it would be so much more effective. But I think that it is precisely this sweeping momentum of street protests and their digital variants that will carry the day, for all the dangers that inhere in them too. If there is any hope still, I see it there. And seen this way, yay, American popular culture is alive and kicking, and may it live long and prosper.
Thank you very much, Ruth Meyer. We now have a couple of minutes for a discussion, a small, short discussion round among the panelists, and then we will open it up to a question and answer. And I would like to ask the first question to our panelists and actually pick up the last point that Ruth Meyer raised. The question of the ways in which popular culture has recently been politicized. Is this politicization, in your assessment, the hope, the resource for a revitalized, democratic, transatlantic culture? Or do we ultimately see what has been more dominant in Vinzenz Hediger's thoughts, and that is ultimately a mass culture-industrial system that has lost all claims to democratic legitimacy or democratic appeals, democratic norms. So I would like to ask that question: how potent do you see popular culture as a resource for a revitalized, democratic, transatlantic culture? Ruth Meyer, you raised the point. No, I don't want you to make it once more, but I would wonder if anybody would perhaps disagree with you here on the panel, or point or phrase it differently.
I think it is, and this is actually refreshing, and it felt good to hear such an optimistic view on state of things. I would rather probably side with Vincent Hediger and see that popular culture as the momentum that the current president, we agreed to call him the current president, got through mechanisms of popular culture. I find this more of a threat to democracy than a hopeful development as Ruth saw it. I'm sorry. Convince me otherwise, that would be great.
Can I just quickly respond, because if that came across as optimism, I'm not sure whether it came across right. I mean, it's more like tracing a little ray of hope than putting all my hopes there. But perhaps I want to pick up on something that was being discussed last night, or that was being brought forth last night in the talk of Klaus Schariot, and that is that there is the danger of a monopoly of a certain kind of direct and fast and very kind of crude address on the side of the current president, and that it is important to take over this territory. And I do think this is currently happening, and it's not happening in politics, in kind of established politics. It's happening, if it is happening, it's happening elsewhere. And it's happening in social media, it's happening in certain kind of, late night political shows, it's happening in completely, or in forums that have gained a significance that is worrisome, but that is perhaps, that's a last territory of to put your hope in. So,
Ellen Harrington, you brought up the category of engaged art and the engaged. You brought up the category of engaged art and the engaged artist. Would you say that the tradition of engaged art is something that is directly continued in the way in which celebrity artists voice protests and make that as part of their profile?
I mean, I do think this is a significant through line in American popular culture. You know, there is a opportunity even within, as was mentioned, the realm of, you know, a massive global star like Beyonce, for someone to actually have, you know, a concept of themselves as an artist that speaks to something much more than image creation or, you know, selling the most number of records or the biggest box office. So for me, the engaged artist, it's always been a through line in American literature primarily, and then of course in music and more in independent film. I mean, the economics of filmmaking are such that the risk is so high with enormous budgets and enormous marketing requirements that basically any, you know, really essential truths, I would say, that are meant to be very principled and very independent-minded are going to end up getting watered down just because of the pure economics of some of these incredibly large film productions. I mean, I will say, just to kind of respond to some of the things that were said a moment ago, as part of my work in coming from Hollywood, actually, I did a lot of sort of what we would call global development work, traveling with filmmakers, doing professional workshops to train filmmakers in a variety of different countries, from East Africa to Vietnam to Cuba to Iran. And what was really compelling often was that I would be asked, you know, how could these culture industries compete with America and compete with Hollywood? And they kind of had set this as some kind of marker or goal. And for me, it was really important to stress that, in fact, that was the wrong question to be asking. And that if they were looking to the humanity of their own life and their own conditions and their own community and telling compelling stories, these are the kind of stories that actually do break through on the global marketplace. And there's many examples of these kind of films. I think Asghar Farhadi's Separation is one of the most exquisite examples. But what has now happened, I think, strangely, because of the decline of American prestige, but also the ascendancy of the internet, the establishment of all these new streaming services, and the pandemic, there's a massive shift happening in the cinema industry. And there's going to be an awful lot more platforms for engaged artists in this particular realm to create works that can be done quickly, independently, without an enormous budget, and that then can actually find audiences. And ironically, because film productions have more or less ceased in the global, you know, marketplace. There's not big studios making a lot of films right now because of pandemic conditions. The movies they've made, they're sitting on them. They're holding them because of these recent examples of disastrous box office. There's just not enough cinemas open in order for these films to make back their investment costs. So cinemas are looking for product. Festivals are looking for product. Some festivals are hybrid and they're having in-person screenings or online. The New York Film Festival is all online. It's just opened with global broadcasting of films that you wouldn't otherwise get to see. And I do think this has a massive impact on the changing habits of viewers, especially younger viewers who do need to be reintroduced to cinema as something other than you know, blockbuster industry. So in some ways, I'm really quite hopeful. I mean, we're seeing it in the products that we're creating at the Film Institute, the way we're delivering our film festivals, the way we're delivering our digital content. There's great opportunity at this crisis time, and I am optimistic for individual voices and global cinema makers to get more of a foothold.
I would like to ask you a question, Vinzenz Hediger, but since you want to respond without me asking a question, then please go ahead.
We'll see. I'll be really quick. No, I have two follow-up points here. I think the case of Beyonce is really interesting. Ruth Meyer said that she sort of stayed out of politics, but and you talked about the regrettable marginality of American independent film. But Beyonce is a really interesting example because the Lemonade video suite is largely a tribute to Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, which was the first American feature film directed by an African-American woman, and which is absolutely unique in its style and its framing of the experience of African-American women. And so Beyoncé uses the global platform that she has to reference that work and to, in a way, translate its message into something that goes far beyond the audience that Julie Dash was ever able of reaching. So I think there's a subtle politics of popular culture going on, and a positive version of what you call pop politics in these kinds of interlacement between, you know, independent artistic creation and global pop culture of American artists. And one of the questions that you could ask about the relationship between pop culture and politics, if the argument is that we're seeing an increasing politicization of pop culture, you could ask the question, well, when was pop culture not political? It's like sports, you know. Everyone talks about how regrettable it is that basketball players are now openly voicing political opinions. But if you look at the history of sports, even going back to the origins of the Olympic Games, sports were always eminently politicized. You know, all you have to do is go back and read Charles Maurras on the Olympic Games in Athens, and you understand that this was basically a nationalistic, jingoistic spectacle, which was much more about geopolitics than bodily performance of any kind. So I think there's a long history of the interlacement of popular culture and politics that we should look at. And the other point that Ellen was raising about emergent culture industries trying to compete with Hollywood, and you argued that was in a way the wrong question to ask, that these industries should cater to their local, regional audiences and build their own sort of realm of cultural resonance. And since Verena brought up Disney Plus, one thing that we have to be aware of looking at the history of Hollywood is that Hollywood is not interested in doing business with poor people. Hollywood has always been a culture industry for the global middle class, and Disney Plus is the epitome of that. You know, you have to be able to afford the subscription. You have to have you have to have an internet connection that allows you to subscribe to this. And there's a large number of people in the world who live under conditions where that is not possible. And so, you know, Hollywood has always left the poor people to Bollywood and Nollywood, essentially. And that's what people are watching in Africa and in India. They're watching their domestic films. The Indian film industry has always had a 95% domestic market share. They're not really that interested in American films, partly because they can't afford them. And in Africa, you get to see Korean films, you get to see Indian films, and of course you get to see the locally produced video films, which, by the way, are a prime example of a low-threshold, truly democratic film industry. You know, this is an industry which is structurally weak, but allows a lot of people to get into it and start producing films and using digital platforms to find relatively large audiences. This, for me personally, is what makes Nigeria so interesting at this point. It's a laboratory of cultural production in the absence of corporate structures, and in a situation where you have almost a level playing field for content creation. And, you know, America doesn't have that at this point.
I'd like to go back to the first question, or first point that you raised, Vincent Seliga, and that is that there is, of course, a history to the politicization of popular culture. I do think that something has changed in the recent decades, and that is because of a term that both Ellen and you, Ruth, brought up. That is the term culture wars. The culture wars erupted roughly in the late 1980s, and as you said, Ruth, it has now moved to the center of cultural production. And so the engaged artist today is part of a particular polarized landscape in which political engagement on an artistic in the artistic realm takes place in a particular polarized constellation, to which then both the culturalization of politics with Donald Trump and Twitter and The Apprentice, and the politicization of culture with filmmakers who express their political views very, very openly play into. And so I wonder whether you would say that the fact that the kind of politicization that we see today takes part in the context of a culture war, whether that actually shapes and perhaps even limits the kind of political engagement that, that is possible under these conditions. In other words, is the kind of politicization that we see as part of a culture war the kind of politicization that we need?
Yeah, I would like to pick that up because I do see that as the biggest problem, you know, that we have, we'll hear some more about polarization, I think, on the next panel, but I think that's really a huge issue, that the fronts are so clear that certain people will only be heard by certain audiences, and that, you know, there are audiences out there that just don't care what Beyoncé is saying because they know that she's not going to speak to them, so that there's always this danger. So the one big challenge that I see at the moment is to find channels and modes of expression that cross over. And as much as I sympathize with the fact, and that's perhaps also what I would reiterate, what I would like to reiterate as the biggest difference, pop culture has always been political, but by now it's almost a requirement for certain stars to be political. It's no longer, you know, penalized if you are voicing dissent, but it is something that comes with the job, at least in the United States at the current moment. The one thing that would be important and to be wished for is indeed for these stark boundaries to break open and to find modes, and that's also something that I see, I'm all with Ellen here, as a possibility of new channels that are very fast and very quick and low key and cheap and manage to kind of go underneath this kind of big and costly productions that, for instance, Verena Lueken was talking about.
Elena, do you want to comment on this as well?
Well, the first thing I thought of was this is exactly why Donald Trump is banning TikTok. You know, and it's just happening in real time at this moment, because it is, you know, a youth-oriented format. It has a different kind of content and a different kind of storytelling expectation. It's very short stories. People build tremendous followings. You know, they become actually quite famous and quite influential. And there is a political component to it. And you all probably are aware that it was an inspiration of a group of K-pop, Korean popular music stars who urged their followers in the United States to register for a Donald Trump rally and use up all the tickets. And this became a big embarrassment for Trump because he was saying more than 1 million people asked for tickets, and he got to the rally and 6,000 people showed up. So this was actually a prank by young Americans that you know, inspired by K-pop, and the fact that there's such a concordance between Korean popular music stars and young Americans, and is just one example of ways that I think this next generation is going to cut through all of the artificial channels that have been here forever. When we talk about the history of Disney, you know, this is a studio founded in the 1930s that has become, you know, so massive and so wealthy and bought up other legacy studios. They bought 20th Century Fox last year, in part to get the intellectual properties of the Marvel Universe, for example. So this kind of dinosaur almost becomes too big to live, you know. It can't carry its head anymore, you know. And the the climate change and the pandemic and the closing of cinemas and all of these things are robbing them of cash, and the cash is what they need to survive. And so, again, I really think that more nimble formats, more low-cost to entry formats and this generation that is already, I would say, certainly speaking, looking at young Americans, most of them came of age in the era of Obama, when there was a sense that America was still really possible. And I think that if you look at the demographics of the people who are sort of more conservative at the moment, who are more interested in keeping the current president in office, that is skewing older. So the question is going to be, will the vote be mobilized? This is something that, in fact, engaged artists are working really, really hard on, and something like the Democratic National Convention, which was this year all on television. There were no live events. They mobilized a fantastic range of very high-profile celebrities, young and older, to speak on behalf of fundamental decency, I would say, was their argument. And there was a lot of dialogue around the fact that for the Republican National Convention, which was held in Corona times, many live events without safety precautions, in defiance, was not able to attract the same level of young or current or hip artists. The artists supporting the current administration could be ridiculed as being out of touch and not having their finger on the pulse of the next generation. So I think that, again, I'm very hopeful that the election will go the way that I prefer it to go, but I also really think that it is, an opportunity for younger people to look at themselves as actually having a lot more power than maybe they ever could have had in the past.
Can I just add a very quick anecdote to this? Because during the quarantine, I was watching, as all of us did that have teenage children, my daughter always checking her smartphone, and I was asking her, but because there was time, what she was doing. And she said, I'm on TikTok. And I was like, and she said, no, it's the political TikTok. And it's indeed, it's amazing. She is almost exclusively following American there you see my ignorance, accounts or whatever you call it, and she's and this is a form of political communication that is immensely compressed, but it's a gateway into a form of communication that I think at the moment is really important and super interesting, and an alternative to much that is happening.
Verena Lueken, I would like to come back to 2 points that you balanced very subtly in your presentation. On the one hand, the focus that you put on the culture industry and the whole culture industrial production dimension, and on the other hand, the tendency towards opening the field to new voices, towards greater diversity. American culture often having focused on issues of diversity in recent years. And can you explain how you would link those two? Do you see those as two countervening tendencies that are basically going in different directions? Or would you say the culture industry is itself so reliant on providing a culturally hybrid, diverse product that it has ultimately absorbed tendencies and dynamics of diversity?
I think both is true. I think the American cultural industry has proven to be extremely open to certain tendencies once they were established as real tendencies and not just crazy ideas of certain people. So I think once, for instance, the Me Too movement got steam, and it was clear it was not just a few women complaining. They did that long ago, before actually the Weinstein scandal broke. But once the Weinstein scandal broke, all of a sudden it became really it became a talking point in all the award sessions, all the festivities. Everybody talked about it. You could not ignore it anymore. And then women did get a foot into the door in terms of what you say, being in the room, meaning they did get the better chances to produce, direct, and so on, but not quite as much as it would really mean that there were equal chances or something. But there is, and I think there will be a backlash, or we already saw it, and the same is true for people of color, of course. And I don't know what you said, Vincent, about Beyonce and Daughters of the Dust. Yes, she does references this movie, but does she really do this outspokenly? I don't know. This isn't, I mean, or is it just something that you can see because you know the movie, or I can see because I do? But I mean, an open reference to to that movie would really open up somebody who does reference it openly as Barry Jenkins, for instance, with Moonlight, the director of Moonlight. So I think the American industry is able to be more inclusive and to integrate, you know, people that were shut out until recently. Yes, I do. But what does that mean for the product? I mean, does that really mean that the aesthetics will change, or does it mean that that women will be able to make movies like men? Or, will it, you know, or black people will make movies that look like they've been made by, you know, the old guys? I don't know. But I think I don't think it's a culture war going on there. I think the American the entertainment industry is always trying to include more diversity in order to get new viewership, for instance, new viewers all over the world, globally, of course, and also to be sort of in the front line in trying to remain exciting, you know, so they need new stuff, new people.
I would like to actually ask a follow-up question that comes directly out of what you said, and that is, do transatlantic relations today need a new aesthetic? Transatlantic relations in the mid-20th century had a discernible aesthetic. It was an aesthetic of anti- or non-conformist individualism. Today, in the age of the blockbuster, is it necessary to find ways to make room for a different aesthetic that can then unleash a political potential for a revitalization of transatlantic relations?
Can I say something? I would like to cite two examples. Verena has beautifully explained how Mulan failed in China, and part of the reason why it failed there was that Hollywood is trying to do what the Chinese know how to do better, namely, you know, wuxia historical epics. You shouldn't even try. If you look at the films, the American films that actually play well in China, the most successful film of the last 10 years is Fast and Furious 8. This is a film that made 1.5 billion globally, out of which only 200 million in the US and 400 million in China. That is the American cinema of today. It's not the Western, it's not the gangster film, it's Fast and Furious. And the other good example of where Hollywood will probably move towards, to my mind, is Black Panther, which is a film which is unique in the Marvel universe because, and maybe Ellen knows more about this, but this was my sense, it was one of the few big blockbuster films of the last 10 years where you basically did not smell the sweat of anxiety in the theater, because blockbuster films are always committee work and a lot of people have their careers riding on it, and if it fails they're going to lose their houses in Beverly Hills. Maybe not, but you know, but they're afraid of losing them. And so all of these films make artistic compromises, and you can basically smell the sweat of anxiety in the films. That was not the case with Black Panther. My sense was that they just let him go about it and didn't interfere. And he created what I think is something really special in that film. But what's interesting is how that film played all over the world. It has instantly become a cultural reference precisely in the areas where Hollywood normally doesn't do business. And it may be a door opener to the emerging markets, particularly in the global south, in a way that other contemporary American films won't be. And the thing about opportunities for women and African Americans, when I did my study on movie trailers in the 1990s, I talked to a lot of people who were in marketing, and one thing that became clear was that they were operating on the assumption, on two assumptions. 75% of the people who go to the movies are under 30 years old, and they go in couples, and the boys make the decision. So all the films have to be designed and marketed in such a way as to attract the male audience and give additional reasons for the women to go along. What we're witnessing right now is a shift in audience choice. The marketers are beginning to realize that young women make their own choices when they go to theaters. African Americans have always been a disproportionate share of the movie-going audience. They're 11% of the American population. They're more than 20% of the movie-going audience, which again has to do with purchasing power. Movie-going is the cheapest entertainment. A theater ticket costs 3, 4, 5 times as much as a movie ticket, so you go to the movies. And this has, of course, not led to an appropriate representation of African Americans in film, because this has been going on for since Hollywood existed. And it has not led to an appropriate representation of African Americans in cinema. It had the shift that we're witnessing right now has not yet led to an appropriate representation or appropriate opportunities for female filmmakers. Part of the reason why that is path dependency. There's still a lot of, the power structure in Hollywood is still white, male, sexist, patriarchal. And basically we have to wait for these people to die and go away. There are several shifts in the history of Hollywood where you can see that Hollywood misses the boat because the old guys stay in power too long. Hollywood, the big crisis in the 60s is a prime example for that. That's a long story. But one of the key factors is that people who came up in the industry in the 1920s and 30s were still in charge in the 50s and 60s in an environment that they no longer understood. So basically, for Hollywood to regenerate and to live up to the challenges that we see now, a whole lot of people have to stop working there.
And but the question remains, of course, it's one thing for a generation of white old men to finally step down. The question is, though, what kind of aesthetic emerges from that? And I would like to come back. Well, maybe then they can remain in place. So can we go back to this question of the aesthetic? I would like to ponder this a little bit more. I think there's more to say about this. It seems to me, if we look at Black Panther as the sort of the film that you just held up as a kind of an ideal, it is ultimately an aesthetic that has very much to do with questions of representation, with diversity, and with empowerment. These seem to be key aesthetic focus points of such an aesthetic. Is that Is that all there is my question.
Well, it's interesting that the Black Panther, not only the success of that movie globally, but also that it was hailed as the first black superhero movie, which it isn't, because the first black superhero movie was shot in the 90s, I think. It was called Blade, and Wesley Snipes played the superhero, and I think the main difference is that Wesley Snipes' superhero was actually a horror figure. I mean, he was the movie is so incredibly brutal, if I remember correctly, and he's called Blade because he has these blades that he throws through the room, and chopping off whatever there is in his way, heads, arms, legs, whatever. Very bloody. But this did not become a standard for the new black superhero movie. The new black superhero movie is this wonderful Chadwick Boseman, who is gentle in a way, he's somebody you want to be friends with. He's extremely powerful. He is somebody who can talk to the UN in the end. He is somebody who is part of our world, even though he's also a Panther. But I think he holds up some kind of a civilized notion of a community, that is something we can relate to, as opposed to just somebody who is destructive and chopping off everything from his opponents. So of course he also is Blade. I think is also a good guy in a way, but it doesn't show. So I think a new aesthetic that is more inclusive is still something that is sort of tame. If it comes from the studio, it'll be something that is maybe new, but it is not radical. There's no radical change in the aesthetics, I think. Of course, something different. I don't know what you do in Nigeria. I think, what the possibilities you have there to explore aesthetic realms that we have not even entered is much bigger than when you have money involved, big money involved.
I mean, absolutely, these films are so expensive, as we talked about, to market and to make. The risk is very high, but what was interesting about what you were saying about sort of the shift in the industry that is expected because it's the politically correct thing to do, because now everyone's discussing the issues of representation, and there's a fair amount of public pressure, and there's a fair amount of shame, and there's certainly very high-profile people who've lost their jobs. And for me, the unfortunate realization I've come to, having worked in the industry, is that shame and public pressure, in a way, is actually going to be the ultimate tool to make this change, because every study that's done in Hollywood looks at the demographics of the people on screen, the representation on screen, the women in the films, the number of minorities, what kind of speaking roles they have, how much agency they have. If they meet something called the Bechdel test, which is, do two women in the course of a film have a conversation with each other that isn't about the man? And most movies fail this very, very basic test. And so you study representation on screen, you study the below the line and behind the screen numbers of what percentage of the films are directed by women, what percentage of the crew is women who aren't the costume designer, the hairstylist, or the caterer. Disgustingly low, really shockingly low. And then you look at all these numbers, and you actually can look at films that have a high representation of diversity in the production crew and high representation of diversity on screen. These movies make proportionally more money every year. It's demonstrable. You can do the math. So these people are not operating on a pure business model. It's really provable that it's not just the bottom line and, we can't take risks, and and it's not only old white men, it's young white men in baseball caps.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is a bro culture in Hollywood where they hire people that look like them, and they want to tell the same story of when they were a teenager and they fell for their teacher or their teenage girl in the classroom who wouldn't talk to them. I mean, not to reduce the entire industry, but there's really the people who are making these decisions, they're coming up on young male coming-of-age movies, and then they get a big toolkit and a lot of money to make superhero movies. And they do have pressure to make money, but they're not really looking very hard for those audiences. And those audiences exist. And those audiences exist globally if American cinema production is going to continue to be a relevant factor in the world. And maybe this kind of moment of reckoning culturally, politically, reputation-wise, along with all of these new delivery channels. I mean, my hope is that it elevates a lot more national cinemas. It makes the transatlantic dialogue a little bit more two-way. One thing that has happened in a positive realm for Hollywood is that they decided at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, where I used to work, that their membership was too old and too white and too based in Hollywood, and they made an ambitious goal to have a higher representation of people from different ethnic backgrounds, different races, more women. They went looking in America and they couldn't find enough people to nominate. So they have now expanded the membership from around 4,000 or 5,000 to about 9,000. And the way they did this is they found international filmmakers. 3 years ago, there wasn't a Korean member of the Academy. This is an industry that is massive, dominant, global, successful, artistic, and there were no members in the halls of the Oscars. So this, I think, is one way where, in fact, the transatlantic dialogue is starting to go the other way. And a leading cultural institution is taking a stand to do this, which I think is really a very, very good development.
Okay, that sounds very hopeful. It's time now to open up the discussion to the audience, both here in the room and also online. So are there questions? The way we do this is we will bring the microphone to you, and then you don't even have to touch it. Oh, and by the way, it is perfectly all right to ask your question in German. Sie können Ihre Frage gerne auf Deutsch stellen. Ob die Antwort auf Deutsch kommt, das liegt dann an demjenigen, der spricht. Ja, hier haben wir eine Frage.
First of all, thank you very much. It's a great event. I'm glad to be here and glad to be invited live, on stage, not on stage, but here. It's also kind of stage. And I'm very glad that I'm able to re-listen to these manifold dialogues which possess a large variety and so on. Maybe you could also produce a booklet. I think this could be very interesting. Now I would like to know, there is so much talk about collaboration on a European level in the business world, in economics. Would it be good, that's a question for Mrs. Harrington, would it be good also to have a collaboration, for example, of European directors, much more, and maybe to help them to get more familiar to the US market? Maybe there are initiatives, but maybe not enough. And I think also the cultural institutions, like for example Goethe Institute, should be funded, should have much more money than they have right now. Yesterday we heard an interesting lecture about weapons and so on. We should have more money invested in defense section, but I think cultural section needs much more funding. Of course, everybody knows it, but it should be done, and also to foster this transatlantic dialogue. That's one question, and a short one. I also appreciate short answers also. And what is your biggest contribution in your job? I often go to the Filmmuseum, and I miss it very much. And I want to be a member of the Friends there also. And then a short question for Mrs. Lueken. How much American influence do you have in your novels? This would be interesting. And your contribution, a brief answer may be okay. Your contribution as a film critic, maybe something innovative, I don't know. And last question for the two actors here on the stage. Also short answers, so we have more chances to hear other questions. There is so much talk also about research. Lots of money goes into research work and so on, which is very good. And I know I'm often at the German National Library, my big place. There are so many books published in English now, yes? So to access the European market, and it would also be good to have them offered on the US or on other English-speaking markets. So what contribution is your research, maybe for this transatlantic dialogue? This would interest me. And do you publish in English? What are your contributions? Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for questions that are each very short, with each a very short answer.
Okay, I'll speak quickly. So at the Film Museum, I would say since I've come, what I've been working on is really preparing the institution for the digital future. We are collecting analog and digital material. We're collecting filmmaking materials. We have a global reach. And for us, it's about being relevant so that young audiences come to cinema, that the international voice of filmmakers is very present in our house, and that we're really prepared for sort of a post-analog world. So that's the goal at the Film Museum at the moment. Just in general, European film often is co-productions. You know, this is an important way that European films are actually getting made. There's certainly an amount of federal monies, public monies that's provided in a way that doesn't happen in the US. US, it's really a very independent or business-oriented model. So European films could use more money, but I'm actually of the opinion that they could use more competition for the films that get funded. And this is a big dialogue happening in German cinema right now, where there's quite a bit of money just to make sure a certain number of movies get made. And within the industry, people are recognizing that maybe those scripts need more work and they're not quite ready for this production phase. And then Goethe Institute, yes, more money.
We all agree with that one.
Verena Lueken, how American are your novels, and what is the contribution of your film criticism?
How American are my novels? Of course, I'm influenced by American literature, so probably it translates into some influence into the way I write and the way I try to tell the stories that I want to tell. So certainly, I lived in the United States for quite a bit of my life, and I love American literature, and this is what I still mostly read. And my contribution to the transatlantic exchange through my criticism, I cannot really say. I mean, my readers would have to say this or to answer this. I guess what I can do as a critic, and what I'm asked to do, is I'm on the receiving end of many of the things we talked about today. So what I see and what I write about in the paper is the product that actually sees the light of the day and of the screen. And I try to be as inclusive in my view, meaning I look not only at, or mostly I don't even look at the blockbusters or only at Black Panther, but I try to see as many movies from all over the world and try to give it their due. So that's all I can do. I can see not to limit myself to the movies that make money, and not even to the movies that actually make it to the theater.
So let me just turn to this side of the podium then, which is the academic side. And I just want to perhaps briefly rephrase the question a little bit to say, how would you conceptualize the contribution of scholars to transatlantic relations?
Now it's more difficult.
Well, you can answer whatever you like.
I was hoping you would ask, how do you see the contribution of scholars to popular culture? That would have been... Okay. I mean, perhaps very quickly to the question of publishing in English and German. I publish in English because more people can read that, and because I'm doing historical work, and there's not... I mean, I'm basically working about the 19 teens, so there is not that much interest in my scholarship. But what I find in terms of having an impact these days, personally so much more important than my scholarship is apart from occasions like these, or occasions where I talk about subjects that are actually not my kind of the field of my scholarly expertise, at least not in the core of it. Apart from this, I find that teaching is the biggest contribution that I can give to establish something like a larger exchange. I have an international program of studies in Hannover. I have students from all over the world, and I find that discussing American literature and American culture with people from the Arab world, from China, from Eastern Europe, and from Germany together is immensely eye-opening for myself, and also has an impact that hopefully kind of goes beyond Hannover, where I teach. And so I put the focus here on teaching rather than research, given my own field, since I'm not working on Nigeria and kind of other interesting areas of the world.
But I'm glad you phrased it that way, and I would totally subscribe to this. Like, if your question is what can we contribute as academics, teaching always comes first. It's the primary mission, and it's where you have the most long-term impact, really, because you have an audience of really intelligent young people who will go out in the world and do things, and you get to help them look at the world and learn to think about it. For our particular field, film studies is a really small discipline, which is really totally international. In our PhD program right now, we have people from India, Nigeria, Italy, France, Israel, Germany, by the way, of Canada, Australia. And what binds them together is that many of the, like the postdocs, all got their PhD in the US. And the other people earned their master's degrees, and many of the other people earned their master's degrees with people who had been trained in American universities. In film studies, the United States clearly is the most important country in terms of research, and teaching internationally as well as nationally. So you can't work in our field without having very, very strong professional ties to the US. And it's part of our daily life.
This is perhaps also something that bears mentioning when we talk about transatlantic relations and when we conceptualize them as something that ought to be studied here at Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, then the scientific community and academic exchanges are an integral part of that. Studying the history of these academic exchanges as much as putting academic exchange into practice. Those are all important dimensions, and I think they need to be cultivated, of course, in an international frame, more generally speaking. Do we have any other questions here in the room at this point? Doesn't seem to be. Mabel, what is the screen situation looking like? Okay. So this actually gives me the opportunity to thank all of the guests here on the podium for a very lively discussion. I also want to thank you here in the room at Bad Homburg and the online audience. So thank you very much. See you all in 40 minutes.